The Cincinnati Bengals are undoubtedly a very hot team right now, but is it sustainable, especially with defenses getting tougher down the stretch? Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm Jake Liscow, joined today by Mike Santagata at Bengals_Sans on Twitter, one of the hosts of the Always Game Day in Cincinnati podcast. We're going to get some film takeaways and look ahead a little bit in terms of expectations for this Bengals team, especially on the offensive side of the ball down the stretch against four of the best defenses in football, coming off a couple of games against defenses that, whether stylistically or statistically, seem to be good matchups, in addition to the Bengals' offensive coaching staff and players making some good adjustments in execution. We'll get into those topics and more film takeaways today in an episode brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets for any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 in bonus bets if your team wins. If the Bengals win, visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. If you're new to the show, you can find us on YouTube, anywhere you get your podcasts. The video sometimes adds a little bit of something if you're not watching on YouTube. Otherwise, we're available on all the audio platforms as well. And Mike, we're going to start out discussing this offense, which yesterday, James and I just spent a ton of time crediting for their adaptations, especially the last 2 weeks. A very different style of play, no empty, more under center, more play action, more screen game. Paul Dehner Jr. points out that they're not actually running the ball more in neutral game script situations, meaning early downs where the score is actually close, which is an interesting caveat that I'll point out to yesterday's show. And there's more to that conversation. I think we'll see if we have time to talk about it today. But the biggest question to me is, as you look at the way that they've been very, very good on offense the last 2 games, how much of that to you is a product of a very good game plan against the style of defense the Bengals played in those games?
Yeah, I think you could attribute a little bit to it just because the run games worked the past 2 weeks. And I felt like the run game worked partially because the run game plan was really good the past 2 weeks. They went from kind of trapping the ends with different run schemes to this week. They were messing with the interior of the Colts defensive line, wham, trap, crunch, and the screen passes too. They're all there. Basically, screen passes could go to the ends too, but they're there to kind of trap those guys, slow them down a little bit, and hit it when they get too far upfield. So does that continue? Can you sustain the success of screen passes and the run game and things that are really easy on a backup quarterback? Or is this where it gets more difficult? Is this where they push them into some of those negative game scripts and situations they may need to pass the ball? But yeah, I would attribute some of it to the game plans and the game script and how everything is gone. But I do think all the guys probably deserve plenty of credit too, because they're all executing much better than they were, especially against Pittsburgh. Thinking of the run plays against Pittsburgh, there's always one guy, and it's just, he ruined the whole play. The block was bad enough that it ruined the entire play. Maybe it was on the front side, so it was a more important block. And now you're not really getting that. If a guy misses a block, it's on the backside, they're staying in front. You know, it's just kind of like a slight loss rather than a drastic loss. And they're running the ball really well. I think staying ahead of the sticks and kind of protecting yourself from having to get into a voluminous passing game is helpful.
Voluminous.
Volume. Is that right?
Anyway, along the lines of the running game, I think there's 2 topics there. One is, are they doing things differently? The answer to that question is yes. You just pointed that out in your last answer. They're running way more of this trap, wham, you mentioned crunch as well, more of these kinds of plays, a little bit less in terms of inside zone and duo, even though those are still plays the Bengals run. Part of that, I think, is evident when you see Chase Brown come onto the field. And there are a lot of fans actually that I've seen talking this week on social media or have messaged me directly and are asking, yeah, you can give the coaches credit, but what are we doing about Chase Brown? Why did it take so long for him to get on the field? To me, the answer is partially. I don't think he was ready in the early part of the season. Maybe they could have gotten to him a couple of weeks earlier instead of waiting until the bye. And then he got hurt coming out of the bye, and he would have been a bigger part of the game plan. That was clearly the plan. If you listen to any of the coaches, both even the game before the bye and certainly after the bye, they're like, yeah, we want to do it. We just have to do it. Then he comes back from the injury and they make a concerted effort to get him on the field. But what's interesting, and this started with an observation from Matt Waldman, they're making things easy on Chase Brown, much like they're making things easy on Jake Browning. They're not asking him to make a bunch of pre-snap manipulations of the second level and reads before he gets, not pre-snap, pre-line of scrimmage, before he gets to the line of scrimmage, making decisions to set up his blocks. They're getting him downhill. They're letting him use his athleticism, which I think is really smart, but also kind of speaks to why there wasn't a ton of volume necessarily available for the kinds of plays that he's excelling at, and they think that he can excel at based on his usage, right?
Yeah, and he's a rookie running back, and his early returns were the game's moving fast for him. You could make the argument, well, you should have sprinkled him in until it slowed down a little bit. But it also is like, well, after the bye, things kind of slow down sometimes for these rookies. And it appears to have done that a little bit for Chase Brown. But yes, when you look at they're making things easy on him, they're not asking him to run tight zone and duo. They're asking him to run things with clear defined reads, kind of like designer runs. You could think back to the Jags game. Most of his runs were that bend play where you know what you're doing. Take 3 steps forward, stop on that right foot or left foot, stop on your outside foot and cut back because that's where the play is going to hit. And it worked, but he didn't have to like think or see that, or there wasn't some incredible read that was designed to do that. And credit to him, he is more explosive, more athletic. And when they make, because Mixon got some of these designer runs throughout the year too, and he didn't make good on them the same way. Maybe there was some blocking there. It's not one-to-one comparison, but it is just he's not as fast. And I think when Chase Brown's able to hit the open field on some of these plays, like crunch, like wham, like trap, like bend, all of these different concepts, toss, crack toss as well, he's gone if he can hit the open field. And that's the whole point of these. You probably can't build the entire house out of these runs, because you're looking for specific looks. You're looking for how the defense is going to play you here. And also if you get to those too often, if you get hit by trap more than, 2-3 times in a game, those interior defensive linemen probably need replaced. I mean, it's like the 4th time you're still getting trapped that bad. It's like, no, they'll eventually catch on. So you kind of sprinkle those in and he's going to make the best of them. But when it comes to their run it runs, like, I don't care what front we're getting, how the defense is playing, or we're going to run it here, and we're going to run this concept. That's still Mixon, because those are more difficult runs that you need a guy that can kind of process things better before the line of scrimmage. And there are pre-snap reads for running backs. At least the University of Texas teaches them about having to read the fronts and which safety's down, et cetera, just to get a feel before they get the ball. Mm-hmm. So I think that goes into it too, but it's just speed of the game. Mixon, it feels like sometimes the game moves slow for him, and for Brown, the game can sometimes move fast, especially when they used to try to have him run like wide zone and all these other concepts that are kind of difficult on a running back.
So to answer the overall question, yes, they could have gotten to Chase Brown earlier. They could have incorporated these ideas for Chase Brown earlier. I think that it's 4 weeks later than it had to be because of the hamstring injury. Could it have been a couple of weeks before that? Could he have gotten a couple of touches here or there before that? Yes. But when you look at his usage specifically, hopefully that breakdown helps you understand how they're using him. And we'll see if this changes going forward, right? Maybe him having success on these plays and using his athleticism to hit the second fastest play in the NFL this year, for example, is something that's helping slow the game down for him, helping him build confidence, and they can get to him in some of their staple plays, the plays that they're running every single game and have been running, and every NFL team for the most part runs every single game. We'll see. But for now, I think that should hopefully answer some of the why not earlier on Chase Brown, even though the answer still is they could have done some of this earlier either way. Coming up next, I don't think we've really answered the question of how sustainable this style of Bengals offense is against tougher defenses, and we need to get into what made the defense so good against the Colts and how sustainable that is as well. We'll go to those topics coming up next. Today's episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by FanDuel. And even though we're into December, the weather's getting colder, the offers in the NFL on FanDuel are still great. They're still hot. And new customers, mention this, can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. So you feel good about the Bengals in their second straight game against a backup or a backup's backup, depending on how you look at the Minnesota Vikings quarterback change. If the Bengals win and you bet on them on the money line, that's $150 in bonus bets at FanDuel. So if you've been thinking about joining, there's no better time to get in on the action. And they've also got spreads, player props, over-unders, so much more, tons of options to bet if you're looking to get creative. So visit FanDuel.com to get into this NFL season. FanDuel is the official partner of the NFL. Mike, let's get into just how sustainable this is. Jake Browning talked about this in his press conference today, which is a great segue to one of the topics I wanted to cover today, which is that the Minnesota Vikings are polar opposite in terms of defensive style as the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts are going to sit there and play mostly cover 3 for the entire game. They're going to rush 4 for almost the entire game. They'll occasionally drop a guy. They'll occasionally send a blitz, but it's very rare. Minnesota, you mentioned this to me before we started recording, so credit to you for knowing this, is near the bottom, if not the absolute bottom of the league, and sending 4-man rushes, or either sending 3 or they're sending 6 is how you put it. The extremes approach, the all or nothing approach are the words you use. So not only are we getting stylistic differences, we're also getting some differences in terms of outcomes. Minnesota's had one of the best defenses statistically and by advanced stats as well, quite strong in terms of their numbers. And that's going to be the case down the stretch. Vikings, Steelers, Chiefs, Browns, all top 11, top 10 defenses, depending on which stats you're looking at. So when you look at the Bengals' approach the last 2 weeks, which has emphasized screen game, play action, under center, trap, wham, crunch, how sustainable are those things against both the style and quality of defenses they'll play down the stretch?
So really, starting with the Vikings, my mind is just, I feel like when teams play fast like that, and we could talk a little bit about later, I'm sure you'll talk about your crossover, but it's not like they just send 0 when they send 6 too. They're playing what's called hot coverage, 3 deep, 2 under, 2 deep, 3 under zone coverage. So it's not like your 0 beater here will work. It's like, well, they'll drop one guy out of like an 8-man front and then, or 2 guys out of the 8-man front and then have 6 in coverage. And now there's a guy where you were thinking you might have where you were hot as a quarterback. Same word for offense and defense. It's weird. But I think that some of this is going to be a little bit difficult to get to because what they've been doing a lot of the past 2 weeks are taking advantage of guys that like to get upfield. And when I think of the Steelers, they don't do that so much. They like to kind of slow play things. When I think of the Vikings, they might do that, especially I think their base is more often a 4-down structure, but they're also going to do their best to confuse the offense and the offensive line and work and stress the communication of those players to be able to pick things up, stunts and blitzes and exchanges, and some guys dropping, some guys coming to replace him, and just making things really tough on them up front, making them think a lot. Maybe some of those plays still work, but you could be looking at trying to trap a guy and he's not rushing upfield. He's rushing in, he's slanting inside. And now you're in a bad spot because he just went inside of the pooler and you got nobody trapping the guy you tried to trap. Same works on the outside too. Just all this different movement can mess with you. So that's why I think almost like, well, that's kind of when you want to start going slow. Like if they're going to run all these different games and whatever, just run inside zone and pick them up as just get in a wall, pick them up and move them. And that way you can just run right behind it. So we'll see. I think this game is really interesting for that. When you look at the Chiefs, they do get upfield a little bit more, but they had that one game where they were very successful running the ball, just basically running duo nonstop with Samaje Perine, but they no longer have Perine. And the Chiefs also kind of adjusted and were able to slow it down a little bit. And the Bengals had a worse offensive line in the second matchup last year, but they also adjusted a little bit. And the guys played better on the Chiefs defense, on their front specifically. And then you look at the Browns. The Browns like to get upfield, but nobody seems to be able to trap or do all that other stuff to them, probably because it's a lot of aliens on that front. So trap works a lot better when it's some guy that likes to get upfield rather than when it's, oh, that's Myles Garrett getting upfield. He could just, cross right back over and make the stop, or whoever it is. So I think they need to probably have a different run game plan the next few weeks. I think they might have to slow play things a little bit more and try to, when they get to designer stuff, it's more of a calculated risk on something they see on film rather than kind of knowing, hey, that guy likes to get upfield. Let's just trap him. I'm not sure if I was, and I think the offense just kind of goes as the run game goes, because until I see it, I don't know if I trust this current offense to be extremely drop back heavy and trust Browning to process and see everything perfect. I think they've gotten to better concepts for him in that, especially in the Jags game. They ran some high-low stuff over the middle of the field, and he did a good job on it. But when I'm looking at the most times that happened, well, that was a Steelers game. In the Steelers game, that was a disaster on offense. So they kind of need to stay ahead of the sticks so that the play action stuff works, so the screen stuff can work, and they can control the game rather than, okay, we got to throw here. And they know we're going to throw, and now they can get into all of their funky looks, pressures, whatever. It's hard to say if it's truly going to be sustainable, but I don't think this exact offense with the trapping and trying to get guys that are going upfield out of position is going to work too much the next couple of weeks.
They'll need another counterpunch. They'll need to change things again, and they'll need to keep it easy for Jake Browning, because what you can't have is, you mentioned the Steelers game, a reversion to that version of the offense, that version of Jake Browning where he's being asked to be Joe Burrow and trying to figure out which half of the field do I read here and where do I think the open guy is in the concept that we're running on each half of the field. I think one of the things, not the one thing, but one of the things that they've done that's really helped Jake Browning is they've, in terms of making things simpler, asked him to make those decisions where he's picking a half of the field much less frequently than they would ask Joe Burrow, because he's really good at it. And I talked about this yesterday, to make those kinds of decisions. And that's one of the reasons that Browning's been able to figure things out. And when you see Browning in the drop back game, it's something that, as a backup quarterback, you would expect would be maybe not quite as good as your elite, maybe top 2, top 1, depending on the day, quarterback in the NFL in Joe Burrow. So you shouldn't have the same expectations. And if you have to play that kind of game against teams that are disciplined against the run, teams that are disciplined in the screen game against play action, that's where things could get a lot tougher for the offense, and they will need to have other answers. And what those answers are, well, we'll see what they come up with, right? Because that is where it gets very challenging. But, they're hitting, they hit glance on an RPO a couple weeks ago. That's something that, some of that RPO game you can get back in and use to a bigger degree down the field. Where the passes are going is going to be very interesting as well, because so much of what Jake Browning is doing is still happening behind the line of scrimmage, which is goes back to the conversation again that we had before the podcast, that Zach Taylor and Brian Callahan and co have made Jake Browning into Brock Purdy essentially for 2 weeks, where Brock Purdy, I think, has like the highest EPA per play in the NFL if you eliminate all of his passes more than 0 yards downfield, just his backfield passes. So some things the Bengals have found to push the right buttons, but it does get harder against harder defenses. And if those defenses can force the Bengals to act in a certain way, well, things will get a little bit tougher for this offense, and we'll see how they adapt. Also want to talk about what went right for the defense, and the defense does have some easier matchups down the stretch. In fact, compared to what they've seen for much of the season, where it gets tougher for the offense, it gets easier for the defense. So maybe it just means the defense needs to step up and shoulder more of the load. And I also want to make sure we hit some individual standouts that you noticed when you were watching the tape before we get out of here. So we'll get to those topics here to finish the show coming up next. This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by PrizePicks, the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And we've told you about how easy it is, how quick it is to get those entries in. All you have to do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections. If you get it right, you're going to get different returns based on how many players you include in your picks. And you'll watch those winnings roll in, whether it's cross sport stuff. You want to bring Jake Browning and LeBron James into the same set of picks. You can do that with PrizePicks. They have quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types. And that's another reason that PrizePicks is the number one daily fantasy sports app. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL. You'll get a first deposit match right now up to $100. Again, at prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code LockedOnNFL will get you a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks is daily fantasy sports made easy. Mike, let's talk about this defense. Great game against the Colts. Trey Hendrickson demolishing another left tackle. DJ Reader with another good game. Jermaine Pratt with a bounce back in a big way. Chidobe Awuzie playing more like vintage Chidobe Awuzie. Contributions from DJ Ivey. What stood out to you the most when you saw the way this team played against the Colts, and what was different compared to the way they played the 3 weeks prior?
Yeah, well, it's kind of weird. Executing was a big part of it. Just like, we talk all about the scheme and all this other stuff. But I feel like when the players are executing at a high level, it's like, well, players are more important than the coaches for the most part. But you got the guys that are, I don't think they did too much different on the defensive side of the ball. I don't think they ran a lot of different stuff. It felt pretty much like what they've been doing all year, but the guys were staying stickier in coverage. The pressure was getting there, especially from Hendrickson against Bernard Raymond. And the one guy you didn't mention that I feel like does need mention was BJ Hill. And it wasn't just the pick. Like the pick was obviously outstanding. It was an incredible play that I think every defensive lineman probably dreams about making. It's just like the ball's in the air. I'm going to make the diving catch here. But he was really good in the run game, and he had a pressure to it. Definitely had one pressure on a stunt as well. So kudos to him. It might have been his best game this year. And when all these guys are playing better, it just feels like it raises the floor of everybody around them. And Chidobe Awuzie is kind of heating up a little bit. It almost feels like the linebacker unit is kind of the litmus test for how is this defense doing. When they're not having a great game, it feels like his defense isn't having a great game. When they are having a great game, like Jermaine Pratt did this past week, the defense is having a great game. So whatever gets, I think part of that is the guys in front of them are probably playing better and the guys behind them are probably playing better, and that helps them play better. But really, it's kind of boring. But it's just like a lot of the guys they did a better job this week than they had in the past few weeks, thinking of the coverage and the pressure, and especially I think against the run, which they haven't done much of this year, was stopping the run, but they did in this game really well. And I credit a lot of that to BJ Hill, DJ Reader, and the front, and Jermaine Pratt as well, making some of those run throughs that I talked about last week. It's cool to see those show up.
I thought Sam Hubbard was noticeably better this week too. He was going against a backup, I think, for the Colts at right tackle, so you would expect him to play pretty well, especially in the run game there. Josh Chupo, he had good PFF grades, Mike. Did he pop on tape to you at all in the run game, or am I catching you off guard there?
I mainly have one specific play in my mind where he did not have a good rep, but I do think other than that, he and Carter have played better. I don't think I'm going to go so far to say that they've been really good or the reason this is turned around or anything, but it does feel like when Reader and Hill leave, it is no longer the liability it once was. I do think they're both playing better, but they still each will have a game that makes you go like, oh, geez, like that guy's really getting driven down the field here.
At least for this 1 week, and maybe next week. Minnesota doesn't necessarily have the best running game in the NFL, so maybe they can run it back. Who knows? We'll see. Part of it is also Gardner Minshew at quarterback. Not a guy that can really scare you when they get behind the chains. They only converted 3 third downs the entire game. I think they were all on the same drive when the Bengals got the Colts into a 2nd and 10 or longer. I think except for those 3 third downs and maybe 2 other 2nd and 10 plus instances that the Colts actually convert from there. So it was really like you blow up one play, you get the Colts behind the chains once, and they don't have answers for a vast majority of the game, garbage time excluded. The one drive where the Bengals went really soft and the Colts had that one touchdown called back. I think this was before the interception, perhaps, where the defense looked bad. But it was a good game. And down the stretch, more backup quarterbacks for, I think, at least two teams, right? Certainly the Browns, certainly the Vikings. I think likely the Steelers. I don't actually know what's going on with Kenny Pickett. And then the other one is Patrick Mahomes, of course, not a backup. But if they can keep playing well, not that the Chiefs have been a good offense this year, and the defense can take on more of the burden, they don't necessarily need to hold opposing offenses to 8 points or 6 points in a 2-point conversion or however you want to frame it every week. But if they can, say, keep them under 20, maybe the Bengals can continue to find a way to get to 20 points in each of these games, 20 plus points. I mean, that might be what we're talking about here. We might be talking about 2017 games, 23-20 games, 20, in that range down the stretch, just given the quality of the defenses that the Bengals will play and the quality of the offenses the Bengals will play. And they'll need to continue to get standout performances as well. Like we talked about, Trey Hendrickson bullied Bernard Raymond for that entire game. They brought DJ Ivey in for his first, I believe, extended run on defense this year, where he had 14 snaps on the defensive side of the ball, had a pass breakup, and individually created a turnover on special teams. So certainly a lot of love for DJ Ivey in this game. If Cheeto can continue to play at a high level and show that he's more recovered than we've seen him all year down the stretch, another thing that will really help this team. Are there any other individual standout performances or plays that you wanted to make sure you highlighted? Because sometimes we get through this whole thing and we get to the end and we're like, man, we forgot to talk about, XYZ player who was really good in this game. I saw you had a couple clips of Orlando, or at least one clip of Orlando Brown on a snatch trap, and the offensive line is a big part, I think, of why this team has been better the last couple of games on offense. So go ahead with your shout outs if you got any for individual performances.
I think the whole offensive line probably deserves a shout out. Yeah, the run game and how they're playing right now is helping them a little bit, but they're still going 5-man protection at times when they do their drop back pass stuff, and they're holding up and they're doing a good job. And that's against a front that's gotten a lot of sacks this year. And they did it against the Jags too, where I wouldn't have placed those sacks on them particularly, but they did give them a couple of sacks. But in this game, no sacks against the Colts, and the offensive line, I thought, in pass protection was really good. You had the Orlando Brown snatch trap. I also think of guy we didn't mention, I don't think. Mike Hilton had one incredible play against a screen where he ducks under a guy, makes another guy miss, and then goes and makes the tackle. And they had numbers on it. He was the only guy over there against 3 different offensive linemen. I think it was offensive lineman blockers. It was about to be thrown if he catches that, and he's gone. He did get juked on the next play, but that's fine. We're only talking about the good one right now. There was a Miles Murphy cross chop. He's learning something. It worked too. It was against that backup right tackle, but it did work. And that is promising because I don't know if he had that move in college. So he's kind of developing and learning some moves.
They might get another backup right tackle. Brian O'Neill, I think, might not be playing for the Minnesota Vikings this week.
Is it Adeniji? Is he still there?
I think it might be Hakeem Adeniji. I guess we better look this up. But we might see old friend Hakeem Adeniji. Might be David Quessenberry. Just looking at the Our Lads depth chart for Minnesota, their backup tackles are listed as David Quessenberry and Hakeem Adeniji. So we'll see who it is if Brian O'Neill, in fact, is not playing. And
could be a revenge game.
I know that he's got something he's dealing with.
Only other play I could think of was Dax Hill made an incredible pass breakup on a pick play where they tried to get him and he went underneath it. Minshew threw it and he was right there to just knock it down. Never at one point. That's why you get these athletes and these guys that are really good in man coverage that are safeties, because they can make plays like that happen on occasion. And that was really cool to see. So I think I hit a lot of the plays that stuck in my mind as great plays. But yeah, I think that's it. There was a play where Alex Kappa torqued DeForest Buckner over. And at first I thought he torqued him all the way to the ground, but he trips. He does torque him to the ground, I guess, but you could see his foot get caught in another player's foot and fall down the rest of the way. And I was like, come
Kappa
on. He put him in that position. Yeah. He put him in the position.
And Cordell Volson has had 3 solid games in a row too.
Yeah.
And two of those games against Pittsburgh and Indianapolis are not slouches on the defensive interior. So shout out Cordell Volson, who took a lot of heat, I think rightfully so, early this year and at times, I think, throughout the season, but has put together some solid games, and they will need to continue to get solid games from the offensive line and this defense if they are to keep it up. Tomorrow, I will be with Luke on Locked On Vikings for our crossover. We'll take a look at this upcoming matchup with the Minnesota Vikings, who scored 3 points against the Raiders last week, which is something. We'll talk about the quarterback change for Minnesota. We'll talk about that Flores defense. And we'll cover all the interesting stories and matchups in this upcoming game on the crossover. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.